Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast, which Craig Touch, myself, Roland Hume, chat some of the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry of writing and publishing. Today, I am very excited by our guest. He is Mr. Aaron Calafato, who's a storytelling expert and narrative strategist. And everyone knows how obsessed I am with the concept of storytelling. So I am sure we're going to have a great discussion today. Aaron, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. I'm equally as excited, potentially more excited. We'll see.
Oh, I'm a very excitable person.
Me too.
So we'll have to... And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, a much less excitable person because he comes from Canada. Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig? What is your level of excitement?
I guess I have to play the straight man, right? Because, we can't all be off the wall. But no, I am pretty excited because I think, Aaron's got a couple of his own podcasts. And I think the interesting thing here today is this idea of storytelling, and especially from somebody like Aaron, who isn't actually an author, right? He's not somebody who's writing these things down, but he has a storytelling podcast and he understands the idea of putting a story together and gathering that story and then telling that story. He just doesn't, necessarily put it on the page. He, talks about it on his podcast. He tells the stories. I don't even know. Let me ask you, Aaron, about what it is that you're doing with that storytelling process, and what do you like? How do you bring it to life once you've done it? And then we'll go back and talk about the whole process in general.
Yeah, sure. I think there are two things that occur during my day, 50%, 50%. So 50% of the day, I'm telling stories on my podcast, 7-minute stories. And this is just an extemporaneous podcast. I put a timer on and I tell a story in approximately 7 minutes. And it's about my very normal life here, about 20 minutes south of Cleveland, Ohio. So not too far from you, Craig. And so, that started about 6 years ago. And it came out of my sort of finding a voice as a storyteller rather than a traditional actor. And there's a story behind that I'll save till later. So that's what I do for 50% of the day. In the last 2 years, we've touched over 30 million years with these stories, which is wild in terms of my initial concept was, who's going to want to listen to this? I'm just this dude in south of Cleveland. What's the deal here? But it was the act of creating these little gems spoken into an existence. And you don't know where they're going because I kind of know where they're going, but I'm in the moment. And so that's how I was trained as an extemporaneous storyteller. So that's 50% of the day. The other 50%, and what gave life to this other 50% of, you mentioned, Roland, narrative strategist, and working with companies around storytelling, is just that. This 7-minute stories ended up becoming the tip of the spear where people go, okay, that's cool. We see that you're reaching a lot of folks. They look at the data story to that as well, because there's data behind it, right? It's nice to be an artist and being creative, which I am. But then when you look under the hood and you go, okay, cool, we have a 93% episode consumption rate. That's high. And in a world, I don't care if it's 70 minutes or 7 minutes or 30 seconds, we all know that with attention spans dwindling, and with people kind of going in and out, getting someone to look at something for 30 seconds, for a minute is key. But then when you look underneath the hood, and this is what podcasting really is great about as a truth serum, is you can look underneath and go, it's not just the download or the listen. You could get in there and say, how long are they listening? And how do I adapt as a storyteller? Or is this something I should be in to begin with? So all that data story lined up, we built a beautiful community, and that gave me sort of license and at least a lot of inbound opportunities where companies were saying, hey, we don't want you to tell your weird Ohio stories. What we wanted to do, though, is figure out what's that sticky magic that you're using. How are you able to take the content that you're creating and get your folks, get your community to listen 9 minutes out of 10? How are you doing that? And so then I come in and work with companies across the board, publicly traded companies, from CyberArk to InterSystems to Glassdoor to Indeed. And whether it's a podcast, whether it's a marketing campaign, get in there, get under the hood, and work on the craft of story with them. So those are the two things that I do during the day, and they kind of both work synergistically with each other.
Now, I'm going to throw something at you, and I want to know your opinion of it, because listeners of this podcast will know I always talk pretentious rubbish half the time. But I have this thing that I keep repeating, that what is a story? And a story, to me, distilled down, is inspiring one emotion in somebody and then taking them to another emotion. And so that means you can fit a story into a tweet or a 30-second commercial, or you can write a book and do that. The story is the journey of having one emotion and triggering another one. And it sounds like, if you want someone to listen to 9 minutes out of your 10-minute thing. You've got to keep them on that journey all the way through. So there we go. I just threw that at you, and now you have to respond.
Well, I agree. I think there's a couple other things that are happening too. I think one, you're right, there's a journey of emotions, but before they take that journey, they have to trust you. So there's a trust factor. Now, what that is, I'm not quite sure, because there's smarter people in the marketing game who know user behavior and consumer behavior. What I knew early on as an artist in the theater, and then as a monologuist, and then now as an extemporaneous storyteller using audio as my medium, is the fact that if you want someone to listen to you, they have to recognize themselves in you. And that means that, especially coming from a monologuist perspective, that's a challenge, because it could easily become about the ego. Me. I want to tell about me and my accomplishments. So for me, the factor, especially in my approach, has always been use me as the vector, as the means to tell the story. But the audience is the people I care about. And ultimately, I need them to find themselves in my story, even no matter where they find me, no matter how different we are. And what we find, and again, you mentioned, you say it's rubbish. I say sometimes it's a trope, but it's real for a reason. There is that universal connection that happens. You can't get away from it. And marketers for hundreds of years have been trying to manufacture it. You cannot. The thing that gets it, the thing that gets that trust, is a great story in which people can trust you. And then they'll take that journey with you from emotion to emotion. Then you're not just telling them something, you're taking a journey with them. And they're alongside of you for that. That's the other thing. It's not something where it's not didactic. You're not teaching. You're not, let me tell you something. And usually the good storytellers know, they come at it from a vulnerable angle where they go, hey, I don't know. I'm not sure. This happened and I don't know how to handle this. Help me make sense of this. So that was always my approach, because frankly, I didn't know a lot of things and I always was lost all the time. And so I think at least offering up that vulnerability in the story helps that listener, to your point, or that reader, take that journey with you, because they trust your voice and they want to take that journey with you all the way through.
I think that's it. Oh, you covered such a lot of ground there. There are like 3 things you covered. There's your story as a creative person to develop that trust, and there's writing stories that resonate with people, and then the second one, the thing that about resonating with people. I was just thinking of Friends. You look like you've got enough gray in your beard to remember that TV show Friends.
I remember. Yeah, man.
Yeah. So which friend are you? We all had a friend that we were.
Oh man, I want to be Joey, but I think I'm Ross.
I'm definitely,
yeah. Or
I'm
Chandler.
definitely Chandler. I don't know who Craig
Are you Chandler? Is. Yeah, you're Chandler, right? Okay.
Yeah. But
okay.
Isn't that funny? Because it's exactly that. You just nailed it. It's like, if you tell a story in which someone can see themselves in it, then they immediately are invested in it and buy into it.
Absolutely. And let me tell you a really quick vignette, and I won't take too much space, is, when I started off, in the acting space. So traditionally in theater, and I was in New York, and I'm from the Midwest in America. And so like we have this experience oftentimes in the Midwest where we're always following the stories of what we think you should do. And so I read, the biography of Marlon Brando and Al Pacino and everyone I saw on the screen. And I thought, if you wanted to be an actor, you either went to New York or LA. And there's some truth to that. It's a little different now, especially with the digitization of the world. But back in the day, you mentioned the gray and the beard in the early 2000s, in the mid 2000s, like, you had to go to these bigger markets. And so when I went out there, I trained as an actor, I got some work. But what I noticed was, trying that uniform on as an actor, I was not able to gain the same trust. I just was not as good in interpreting the words of an author, of being a vessel for someone else's words. What I found out was, when I was telling stories casually just about my life, that's when I started to gain the trust. And I was in this little diner next to the acting studio on 25th Street in Chelsea. And I would go in there, made friends with everybody, because they made the best bacon, egg, and cheese sandwiches in the world. And so you'd line outside and you'd stand there in the cold, and I'd become friends with everybody there. And I'd become friends with the owner. And eventually he hears me telling stories, and he kind of sees just the vibe that's happening there. And he offered me $200 cash to come in and just tell stories like I did in line, just to keep people drinking coffee and to eating sandwiches. And I remember I was like, okay, this was a sign, not just because of the money, but it was a sign that maybe, to your point, the trust I was getting was actually through what I didn't expect to be doing, not what I thought I wanted to do. And that's the other part, is like realizing sort of that strength. And I knew early on that trust is essential. I wasn't getting the same kind of trust, that same buy-in when I was portraying a character, but I was getting it when I was telling a story, true story about my life, to people that I care about. And so that's a hard thing to admit, because I spent most of my life building up to wanting to be an actor on the stage. And I had to come to the realization, wait a second, there's this other thing that might be better for me and for the audience if I want to pursue this life.
That makes me think, in all of these years that I've been selling books, Craig and I, we got into this business, and I was writing romance books and he was writing romance books, and we wrote under a pen name. And I've noticed that even though I've sold 70,000 copies of those books, and it's great because of various things, it's really difficult to organically make sales and stuff like that if you have a pen name and you're not a real person. Whereas I also write books under my own name, and I'll post a link to it, and I'll create social media content, and I'll just be like, hey, if you like what I say and you fancy buying me a pint, buy a copy of my book instead. And people will do that organically because they're buying into me as a personality rather than the thing I'm selling. And that's so interesting to what you just said about selling the coffee. It's about selling the stories and getting people interested in you by being authentic and by being who you really are.
You identified a couple of things there. And I want to throw a question back to you both, because I relate very much to self-published authors. That's the other reason why I think we got connected, because I'm always talking about independent publishers. And on one hand, as you all know, there's the unbelievable challenge and daunting task of what that means. On the other hand, there's an opportunity to really shape a narrative. And the way I see it is actually the way you described it, which is, let's say in a series like I have with 7-Minute Stories, the listener is getting two things. They're getting the day-to-day, they're getting the week-to-week stories. And that's a journey, because that gives you this bigger slice and this of a moment, or you get an insight to an experience. But over time, then you actually get a relationship with the character of me, which is me, but it's still an iteration of me telling the story. And I wonder too, and I've experienced this with authors, I've always felt that, where it's like, you get the novel, but then there's also the mythos around that writer and who they are. And even folks with a pen name, there's a mystery there, right? So I guess for you both, do you, and in terms of speaking with other authors, and then the marketing side of it, how much attention as an independent author or someone who's trying to self-publish does one have to pay to their own story, to their own mythos, especially when you have limited bandwidth and you're actually just trying to do the work, right? Because ultimately it's the work and it's the story that matters. But it seems like in this day and age, there must be attention paid to the archetype of who the author is. Or is that just a misconception that I have? I've always felt like a connection there, and at least a synergy with folks who are self-published, because I'm self-published, just in a different medium.
So I think you nailed it. I was just thinking, he's not self-published, but Jack Carr, massively popular author because he's got his Amazon show and stuff like that. But he is so successful on social media and selling his books because he is a character. He's a former Navy SEAL, and he lives in Utah, and he drives a 20-year-old Toyota truck, and he goes hunting all the time, and he has videos of what he's doing. And when he sells special editions of his books, he shoots through them with a rifle. And part of it is his personality, and people they buy his books because they want to buy into what he represents. And I think he does such a great thing with that. So I think that's kind of, I think it's an absolutely valid thing to say part of your success as an author can very much stem from who you are as a person and what you represent.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Oh, go ahead, Craig.
I was just going to say that, one of the things that I often tell authors that, that talk to us, we work with a lot of them, and the reason why there's this factor that often is seen in a successful self-publisher that is often not seen in someone else is their ability to share on social media and create a connection to their audience. Even if they're using a pen name, as long as they're going all in and saying, they're still sharing things about their lives, maybe not their real name, but they still might be sharing about what's happening in their life, their writing process, all that stuff, and they're doing that successfully, and it's making that connection with the audience that really, I think, helps define them and make them successful, as opposed to authors who, and I was guilty of this too back in the day, and it was harder for Roland and I because we were writing romance and we were writing them under female pen names, so it's not even like we could pretend well, this is me, but I'm just using a different name. Like, we didn't want to even come out and say we're men writing as women. So I didn't do that, and I think we were successful, but there came a point where it became harder and harder because everything shifted. This was back when Amazon was self-publishing was new, and it was much easier to be successful. But then as stuff changed and the writing community evolved, they sort of gravitated to the authors that did do that, where that were much more open about who they were. And I find that, it's not like you can't be successful without social media, but it really, the ones who are very successful are almost always doing social media really well and doing that sharing about themselves.
You make a really good point there. And I just, one thing to add to that, because it's right. And there's a truism there. At the same time, speaking to any author listening right now, I also know, just being friends with a lot of writers and a lot of authors or folks who are in that creative space, there are a lot of folks who have trepidation for doing it. There's a lot of folks who are, when you hear, and rightfully so, the nature of what social media is, there's a understandable hesitance for a lot of folks, especially who have artistic integrity, to go, okay, do I got to do the thing? Do I got to do the dance? Do I got to do this? And I understand that. I would say, from a podcasting point of view, one of the great things that you can do and leverage the capturing of your storytelling and use it on a social media platform, whatever that is that you choose. I think, one, there is still a sense of autonomy and control. So for any listener who is an author, you can still find ways to give insights to your background, your process, your story, best practices. And as a person who tells autobiographical stories, I can tell you, I'm a very private person. And that's part of the artistry. I'm only selecting what I want to share. It's not like you're turning the camera on, the microphone on, it's a documentary going around the house, all the nooks and crannies. Now, I'm drawing from those nooks and crannies, but I'm choosing that. I'm the author. I'm the person that vets those moments. So I'd say I agree with you 100%. And it often is great to hear and empowering that even if you're an author who needs to utilize those spaces a little bit more and optimize those for sales, for awareness, for conversion, whatever you're trying to do, that method is great. And just know you can control it. You can control the platform that you use. And even if you find one singular pillar, right? You can use Instagram Threads, for example. You can use a lot of different spaces where it could be the written word, or maybe it's video, but it's a different angle. These types of things are great. And it doesn't have to fall into the stereotype of the kind of the social media that we see, that it's kind of the lower form of kind of a brain rot, as my kids say. So I think there is something empowering there about doing it. And there's a way to thread the needle to still do it with artistry and integrity.
Yeah. And I think your audience, once they get to know you, through what you're sharing, whether it's curated or not, they like you said, they build the trust, but then they also want to help you. They also want to share out, hey, look, this person's a great writer, they wrote a new book, or they want to buy the book when it comes out. And you're really helping yourself, even just by being authentic and not actually trying to just sell to them.
Yes.
Yeah. So listen, let's take a step back now and talk a bit about your you have this phrase you call it story catching, right? So it amazes me that you have the 7-minute story podcast and it's all autobiographical. I'm like, you must have led a much more interesting life than I did. Plus, you have a much better memory. I mean, I can't even imagine how many things I could even think to tell to fill up. How often are you even doing these episodes? How many do you have?
I've told 320 stories in a row.
Man.
Every week.
So what that's, I couldn't even think of a third of that to tell. So how are you, pulling these stories together? What's this method of story catching that's taking what I assume is a mundane piece of your life and turning it into something that people will want to listen to?
Yeah, so I think writers can relate to this in the sense that, one, I found that short form was a pocket for me that I really enjoyed for volume and consistency. One thing I couldn't do, I can't imagine writing a novel. I don't know how people write novels. I don't know how you all do it. I mean, just like that process. And I'm always trying to learn from authors. How do you, like, from page 1 to page, hell, like 80 or 800, whatever it is. So that kind of process for me, it didn't fit my style of storytelling. But what I found, though, was there when I started off, I was touring monologues, and the monologues were about an hour, and I'm pretty competitive. So I would watch tape or listen to audio just to make sure every time, like, what can I do better? Where did I mess up? And I'd look at the tape and I'd listen to it. And I noticed there was this naturally occurring cadence that I told stories in. It was about 7 minutes. I don't know why that's the case. It just was. And that kind of hit me that even these hour-long monologues were vignettes. And so then when I looked at it, when thinking about starting the 7 Minute Stories podcast, the idea was, okay, well, I already naturally have this ability to kind of tell a story. And if I kind of have room to move in it, I can tell it and I can land and hit that mark. I know that the 7 minute mark, or at least 7 to 10 minutes in a crowded space, and it's a lot more crowded now, but even then when I started 6 years ago, it's crowded for any creative. So just being a creative, it's crowded. Right, I'm not going to sidetrack too much here, but your writers know this. Like, you're in a crowded space to begin with. Then my thought was, well, it's a huge demand, especially from a voice maybe they haven't heard in mainstream media, a person that doesn't have a celebrity image or didn't start with a celebrity image to sell or to get that inbound attention. I had to do something that was a little bit convenient for the listener. So there was a strategic part to it as well. I was like, well, I know that if I can fit into the space in their life, they're more likely to give it a shot. And then if they give it a shot and I can deliver it, they're more likely to come back, and then they can still fit it in there. And so that's sort of the strategic part of it. But the crafting part of it was taking that natural ability. And then from the story catching standpoint, well, how do you capture all these? For me, I've always, in my training as an actor and as my training as a creative, always thought about the world in stories. And so there's intentional exercises, stuff that I do that's now just part of my life, where I think and look in stories. So I'm not just walking around, just like a stand-up comedian would take, a notepad and write things down, little moments, little inconveniences, little moments of grace, and examining them just in my own mind. It doesn't have to be this, there's not equations popping up everywhere. Everyone has this. And in fact, recently on one of the podcasts that I do, I talked with a wonderful person. His name is Angus Fletcher. He's a story scientist. And he comes from a neuroscience perspective. And human beings, we've been using stories to solve problems initially during our evolution, but essentially turned it into a mode to connect, not only to survive, but also transcend. And so knowing that that's part of who we are, we have that inclination. And I would argue that through a lot of our processing and through a lot of our education and the systems we're put into, which haven't really stayed with our true nature and haven't really maybe caught up to where we need to be, we often are kind of burnt out and told not to think that way. Stop daydreaming. Stop thinking this way. Stay on task. It's very industrialized. And so it feels like a factory. And so for me, your operations can be a factory, but your stories should be a garden. And so you should always be tending it. You should always be thinking about your life. You should always be thinking about your impact on the world. So I just walk around, Roland, Craig, all the time, just thinking, okay, how did that feel? What did I experience there? And did it land on me? Or is this something that stuck with me? Was there a moment here that could be a story? And if it is, I just remember it. I go to my whiteboard, I put one bullet point, and I say, there's a story. And it can be and the beautiful thing about the short form is then I can really get into the granular. I can get into these really finite moments, and they don't have to be big. I mean, I could take a moment where I see an article or have an experience at a drive-through, for example. I've been really on this kick of complaining about drive-through service at fast food. Every once in a while we go out for fast food. It's a disaster. The order's never right. You don't know how to communicate the order. The speaker never works. It's all these things we all laugh about. Stand-up comedians hit on it all the time. But for me, I could take 7 minutes and just walk through why I don't think companies should give up on AI as communicators in a drive-through. In fact, Taco Bell's chief information officer or technology officer admitted to the Wall Street Journal that they rolled out these AI machines taking orders, and they're like, maybe it was a mistake. And I'm saying, please keep them, because for me, it used to be affordable to go to a fast food restaurant. Now you're paying $50 to feed a family of 5 on the run. On top of that, right? Then you go through the drive-through and they get it wrong. We've lived our lives this way. Oh, yeah. And so for me, so it's these type of things. That's just more of like a gripe, but I take that, and that'll be this story this coming week. It's I think the title is, it's going to be, the case for not giving up hope on AI drive-throughs. And that's it. And it just kind of starts off with, your writers know you start off with an opening in the present. I start off with a hook. Here's a proposition. Here's a question. Here's a claim. And then what I usually do is walk myself through this. And 9 times out of 10, I'm the one who's wrong. 9 times out of 10, you don't expect how the story ends, or I don't expect it to end like that, or I get a learning and I share that with the audience. So it's very Aesop fable. It's very, there's something Rockwellian about it. It's not, it doesn't mean to shock the audience. It's a reliable narrator stumbling through a very regular life. And so I just fit those experiences. I record them all the time, and I just reproduce them by telling them off the cuff.
I think that's brilliant.
Yeah. It's almost like a 7-minute rant, but I assume they're not all like that.
No, that's the thing, is that you're right, because that would tax the audience, and that's where the curation of how I share those stories. So, one story we could talk about, an AI fast food integration, but the other one is maybe taking you to a memory of my grandfather's house, and I actually take you to one day. And we start off with the car ride when he picks me up and he gives me an unexpected breakfast sandwich that surprised me. And we go through the whole day, and it takes us to the kitchen where my grandmother's making meatballs. We're Italian-American family. And I see her smile through the steam of the meatballs. And then my grandfather and I go walking in our track suits with our chains out because we're Italian-American, and that's just how we roll. So these type of things, right? So now you're talking about grandpa. It's memories from grandpa's house. And so the topics and the stories from my very regular life, I think, really connect with that universal sensibility, because we all have memories, we all complain, we all have rants, but we all have moments of vulnerability and great. So it's just tapping into the human zeitgeist. That's it. Now, the performance part of it, I would say there is a lot. That's the thing that differentiates. It's not easy. And that's why, in the same way that it's not easy to write a novel, it's not easy to turn on a recorder and just tell the story. That's been years and years and years and years and years culturally of being brought up that way around the dinner table. You had to fit your story in a small space at the Italian-American dinner table, right? You're a kid, you're at the kid table, then you're 12, maybe grandpa will let you have one sentence. So you got to get in quick. Guys, I got a story you won't even believe. So you got to have your hook. Wait a second, guys, I saw a dead guy the other day. What? Yeah, let me tell you. Boom. Right? So you had to have so I learned hooks because of finite space. But then once you had the hooks, you got to keep their attention, because you don't want your uncle, your aunts laughing at you or busting your balls. So then you had to keep them going. So that sort of cultural training had a lot to do with it. So there is that. But then there's also just thinking, catching stories all the time, and then telling them privately. That's the other thing. It's a sensibility of the human experience, where telling stories, making them intentional at work, with family. I'm gonna tell you a story. Everybody knows that person at a dinner party that can just tell a damn story. Y'all sit around. Let me tell you something. Yeah, right there. Boom, we're in it. I always felt comfortable in that space and in that role. And so it's a lot of that combined with intentionality, then combined with strategy. And that's kind of how it fleshed out the form that you're asking about, from story catching to then storytelling, and then capturing it, and luckily being able to get some folks to listen to it along the way.
That was beautiful. My wife is Italian-American from Long Island in New York. So as soon as you were saying about, when you are trying to get your voice heard at a busy Italian dinner table, you have to go in with something like, hey, did you guys see the dead body, or something like that?
That's right. Small space. Yeah. Fitting it in small space, and getting, and getting attention was hard to come by with lots of different competing voices. And so without knowing it too, these are serendipitous things that kind of, and that's that kind of that moment I was talking about where I'm realizing now, oh, okay, that's why maybe I got people to lean in with my own stories rather than when I'm trying to play Hamlet. You know, I as much as I tried to be or not to, as much as I tried, they didn't believe that as much as they did when I talked about, you know, my grandfather, or, you know, what it was like to ask my wife to, you know, marry me and then go see a Bob Dylan concert the same night. You know, it's like these kind of things. And I think it's also just the admission of normalcy, that the stories are not coming from let me tell you, I just reached the mountaintop. I'm not even fucking close. Sorry for my language. I'm not even close to the mountaintop, meaning I'm stumbling every single day to try to live a good life. And that sort of struggle, I think, is also unifying. I think most people are in that lane, trying, failing often, but trying to live a good life, trying to make the right choices, trying to be good parents, trying to be good at their job. We like paying rent what the rent's due. That universal sort of human experience, for me, that was always pretty standard and easy to tap into. And so it's not rocket science in that sense. So that lends itself to connecting in that way. So to a certain degree, it's a lot easier than being a stand-up comedian. It's a lot easier than being an author who's writing fiction. I can't imagine what y'all do. What you do is it's magic to me. So that's why I think these conversations are great, because we can kind of learn from each other, and, you know, the circles that we are in can all learn from each other, especially as independent creators. So, yeah.
Yeah. So when I originally thought about what you did, I was thinking about the idea that I couldn't tell that many stories. Like I couldn't even think up that many stories. But when I was thinking about it in sort of a fictional landscape, you know, a book or a short story, you need all those different elements, and you need a satisfying conclusion of what was set up. It seems like verbally telling a smaller vignette about your life is a lot more doable than that. So maybe from that perspective, I still don't feel like I could tell that many, or you know, make them interesting. But I do see your point about, you know, how you're saying, like, from your perspective, you're like, oh, authors do this whole different thing. And I was thinking from your perspective, it's like, wow, you're telling a lot of stories. But yeah, there's a different skill set, or a different, I don't know, not even skill set, but it's a different, you know, way of working towards that. And, you know, it makes it more understandable to me.
I think I think you're right. I think it's clear to me that there are some people who just build universes differently, and some people, writers, creatives, artists, you know, they build big universes, wide, you know, ranging. When you're setting up that story, and you have to set up character arcs and this sort of long game. Whereas for me, I still build universes, but they're just really small. They're pocket universes where you could kind of go in, and it's just like, you know, what starts as a rant about a drive-through ends up kind of leading into a question about how far should we let technology make things perfect. And then you kind of just leave it where there's more questions than answers, but there is still that satiated satisfaction that the listener gets or the reader gets. So it's interesting to kind of parse out these different forms of telling stories, but I still, you know, double down on the catching of the original kernel of a story. It is pretty universal. Like how it builds out is one in a million different methodologies, but how it's caught, for the most part, I think that's where we have a lot in common. Like certain things hit us, certain characters move us, and then we tell it different ways. But I think that's where the conversation gets really interesting, and we get closer together as creatives, and there's a larger bucket of storytellers where authors can talk to, you know, podcasters, and podcasters can talk to sculptors, and sculptors can talk to musicians. We all have that kind of language. It feels like just different modes of expression.
That reminds me of something you said earlier about how the whole point of being able to tell a story is to have a character or a situation people can relate to. And to me, that reminds me, we find ourselves talking about fan fiction a lot, which is stuff that people write. You know, you write a supernatural story, like they get together and stuff. And the reason people like writing fan fiction is you don't need to have any of the characterization or the backstory or anything like that, because you love this TV show. So if they write a scene with Sam and Dean, then you can just go step into it and you can see a scene that makes you feel something, and then you're done with it. And it's the same way when you tell your stories. You need to find something a situation that someone could relate to, like being in a drive-through, and then suddenly they're right there with you. So you don't need any of the backstory that makes up, you know, the first 15,000 words of a novel or something like that.
That's a really interesting. That's interesting to find that. You're right. There is the what's the in. And to your point, fan fiction, you know, my daughter, she's really into, you know, My Hero Academia. It's like a, I sound like, I don't know what that's, but it's, you know, anime. And she says, yeah, there's a lot of this fan fiction where people create. And I was like, oh, okay, you're right in it. But to your point, yes, if it's so obscure and you're telling such a story that is so far removed, you really, the craft there, I mean, what a lift. But to your point, especially if it's a short story, we got to get right there. And it's funny, I didn't even realize that there is sort of an unknowing knowing of saying, like, let me take you right to this thing that gets you to the moment, that gets you in. And then from there, the work is still hard, but it's a lot easier than kind of taking you like way out here and dragging you along the way. And I think that's one thing that at least writers have. They could use their craft to kind of build out a long journey. And if you can get them in, that's a beautiful narrative that you can tell. But yeah, it's fascinating. It's a correlation I didn't think about before.
Yeah, you know, it's like you're taking these bits that are relatable. So yeah, everyone's been to a drive-through. Everyone has a grandfather. Everybody had, you know, and I guess there are probably ones that you did that were more obscure that maybe didn't relate as well. But it makes me wonder. I wanted to ask you about whether you know, whether you have, I don't know, any stats, any ideas about how sticky, you know, your podcast is from episode to episode. Like, do people tend to, you know, look at the topic and watch that one more than, you know, they watch every week? Because if you're watching every week, you know, you know more about you understand it more. But if you're telling these vignettes that are open to anybody because they're so relatable, then it doesn't even matter. And I'm wondering, you know, if you have any knowledge of that.
Yeah. So there is a data story behind there, and it on one side, it's a really, really good story. On another side, it's a story of patience and sustainability. So at least with this particular podcast, 7 Minute Stories, this has been something, and we were talking earlier about the persona of the storyteller or the writer and how much that plays into the reader or the listener taking the journey. I suspect, for example, I know this is probably because I'm like not in the same world as you all, but so listeners, please forgive me, but let's just say, I think about Stephen King. There's a stylistic element to his writing that people love, and it is, I'm assuming, uniquely his, and he tells a story in a particular way. He's not the inventor of it, but there's that thing. And I feel that there's almost multiple consciousnesses at play when we're consuming a story or reading a story, listening to a story. The assumption is when I'm reading, I enjoy the choices the author is making, but if they're really good choices, they're in the background. They're not trumping the story. They're not jumping in front, jumping the shark. They're not getting in the way of the narrative. I think the great storytellers are ones where you feel their style, but their style doesn't impede the ultimate gain, which is the narrative. So, but there always is that. There's a style. So you're kind of like, oh, I really like this. Just like a band. Like, oh, I love Pearl Jam. I love the sound. I like but after a while, I'm not just thinking, oh, it's Eddie Vedder singing. Oh, it's, you know, Jeff Ament, whatever. It's the song. It's the story. It's the style. So it all goes hand in hand. I say all that to say, when I looked at the data from my stories, it started, you know, totally independent media, just me in my basement. And year over year, we grew. So my first year had about 10,000 streams. And then but I didn't know if that was good or bad comparative to most podcasts. That's like really small, I guess. And I don't say most podcasts, excuse me, most podcasts that are competing in the market of like, what's a good podcast and what's being recommended, what's in Apple's, blah, blah, blah. But still, I thought to myself, 10,000 streams, that's a lot of people. And then when I saw some of the stats, the data of other shows where I was trying to just see where I was in terms of the market, if you will, I remember my wife was like, I want you to think about something. Don't freak out. Like, imagine 10,000 people in a venue. Remember, you're going deep, not wide. Your type of storytelling, don't think that you have less to offer because you don't have this sort of like the commercialization of numbers and this marketing engine. You're just this dude in Ohio. So just be grateful for, one, that people are listening. You're extremely skilled, but she checks me. She's like, but just remember, you have those folks. So then year to year, we've doubled. I mean, it got to a point now, like I said, the last 2 years across platform, we've reached 30 million streams. Now, the under the hood data that I'm nerding out here, I'm glad you asked this, is not just the amount of streams, but you're asking about per story streams. And then I could even get into, I mentioned it earlier about episode consumption rates. And I do think, I don't want to lose the listener here, because writers too, this is really important. That same process is happening page to page. That same process is happening sentence to sentence, chapter to chapter. I'm not saying I know about what you all do. I'm saying, I'm assuming it's that thing that's sticky and that becomes bingeable, or one more chapter before I turn off the light, one more thing, right? So, as you know, radio, they used to call it like car park moments or something of that nature, where you got to listen to the top of the hour before you go in for dinner, and you're in your car listening to the radio. So what I noticed from beginning 6 years ago to now is my episodes do not wane in terms of huge spikes that are topical, meaning I think because I'm not going after the big sizzling sort of like what's in the moment, this political headline or this thing that really pisses people off or this thing that's in the news. For me, sometimes I incorporate the zeitgeist of what's happening in my life and in culture, but oftentimes it's just my own discretion of what I find interesting. So the data there is, month or episode to episode, the streams are pretty equidistant. And so what that lets me know is that, one, it took me a long time to grow month over month because I wasn't gaining tons of new listeners per one big episode. It was slow but steady. And we have a ton of returning listeners. And so if I'm getting somewhere in the range of, between 10 and 17,000 streams per episode, it's like, we see sometimes there's a variation, but not that much. There's some real, and you can edit out whatever you want here, but there's some really interesting stats here, because when I look under the hood, the consumption rate is the most important thing. And the average consumption rate of each episode in the last 6 years was 92.3%. So they're listening all the way until the credits. And I always say I feel bad for my sound engineer, because right when they get to his name, they turn it off. And so that's a great sign. That has not changed. In fact, it's essentially been the same since the very beginning with 10,000 as it is for in the millions. The other thing I'm noticing is when we're looking at not just consumption rates, but we're looking at episode to episode, month to month growth. This is just happening naturally through word of mouth. There's a little bit of ad spend, but there's not a ton because I just don't have the operating budget for it. So I'm really relying on going back to the Stephen King analogy, that, for lack of a better term, the Stephen King analogy, that the persona, the character of me as a storyteller is one of the stickiest parts, and that the story is the thing that, even if there's a stinker or there's one that just doesn't land, or maybe I get kind of nerdy and weird and I start talking about stuff that only I think is interesting, there's a forgiveness, because then the next episode I usually hit the mark. So those are some stats and some data, and I look at it that way too. And I realize I'm going to lean on that trust of the audience rather than trying to go after the big fish. I just want to keep deepening and deepening and deepening and building that trust as they build their trust in me as the storyteller, knowing that most of the time I'm going to hit the mark with stories that, they feel connected to.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah, and I think it's important too for authors that are writing books, writing series. You need that same sort of thing. You want to build that audience, and that's often what we tell authors when they're writing a series is, that first book might not be a big seller, right? And then you write the second book, and then maybe things grow a little bit. And as you write more and more, assuming it's a good series, you're going to grow your readership, and then it's easier even to sell into it, right? It's easier to make the ad spend even, because now if your books are sticky enough, you spend usually on the first book to advertise it, but then you're going to get people buying, right? So it's sort of the same concept where you do want to make your content accessible to people and want them to come back and read more or listen more. And I guess in a 7-minute, that is, it's great, 92%. 7 minutes, and you're telling a story. People probably naturally just want to hear the end of the story. It's not like they have to wait half an hour or 45 minutes. Our podcast is probably too long, like people probably skip around and listen to stuff. But when you're telling a story, especially a really quick one, I think that really helps your case, because it's like, why wouldn't you just, everyone's got 7 minutes to spare, you might as well listen to the end. And I think, that's something that authors can think about too. And like you said, with chapters too, I remember like Dan Brown, when I used to read him, he every single chapter ended on a cliffhanger that made you want to read. And it's like, oh, I can't go to sleep every time I'd read it. Oh no, now I need to find it. What happens? So yeah, there's that too, that authors really want to try to get into their work.
I wonder, from an author's perspective, I know for me as a storyteller, there's the blending of the tactic and the art. And you mentioned Dan Brown. There's a myriad of great authors who do it, where they use the tactic that it's a signal. The reader knows, the listener knows but you have to do it in such a way that it doesn't feel so tactical. There's this kind of thing that happens, right? Where it's like, or for me, even if it's an obvious hook, I try to do it in a way where I'm in on the joke. So even at the top of the show, the first 30 seconds, it's like, I opened the garage door and you will not believe what I found laying on the garage floor. It shocked me, and I'm sure it's going to shock you. And I'll get to that right after the music. And I'll even laugh through it because it's such an obvious. So it's almost like, now that texture with audio, I have the ability, I think, to kind of have that layer of, okay, but writers do too. I've always found just some of the most interesting writers, the ones I can't stop reading or listening to in an audiobook form, are ones that do exactly what you said, which it's so bingeable, but the art ends up delivering the promise, so that it's not all tactic. And then you're like, okay, and then you just have to sit through this thing. And now we all been there too. I've been a person who I get into the tactic, and now it's become more of just a thing where like I have to get through based on the fact that they've got me into the tactic tornado. I can't get out of it. But man, when you can blend those two, that's something special. And I'm assuming too, that's something that writers are always wrestling with, between art and then the tactical form, to keep that person there. That's got to be such a tricky balance.
Or even to buy into it. Originally, I was just thinking a few weeks ago, we spoke to a great writer called Terence, about short fiction and how, men aren't reading these days. That's because men like to have short reads, and maybe writers, they want to tell a story, but they should think about the practical dimensions of what they're selling. Like, it's a story that, if you sell as a paperback and it's only going to take a day to read, and that's going to appeal to people just functionally. They want to read a good story, but they also want to know what they're kind of getting. So you're delivering a product at the same time you're expressing yourself and being artistic.
Do you all have experience with either writing short stories? I know you talked about the books that you read. What is your thoughts, both of you, about the short narrative? Because for me, just exactly what you said, Roland, like, I've always been addicted to short stories. One, they're timely. I also love the art of it. It's an art in it of itself. There's so much left to the reader or the listener. There's so much trust that you give. You have to meet them. You have to meet the intellect of the reader and the listener, because you're giving them sort of the director's wand. You're telling them, I'm going to let you tell a lot of this story, but I got to give you guideposts to fill in the gaps. I love the minimalism of short stories. And I remember my father would always send me, the compilations, the anthologies of like best short stories of 1992. And so when it comes to writers, is this an avenue for not just testing a market, but are there any people, even in a contemporary sense, educate me, that are essentially making their calling card the short written book, like do you know what I'm saying? Or anthologies. I feel like, we know about poems, we know the virality of short form on social media, but are there folks, at least in the people that you're talking with and in your network, like who that's their calling card in the same way that short stories are my calling card? Is that a harder and a bigger hill to climb when it comes to marketing and making a name for yourself, or is it easier to a certain extent because you can do more? What's your take there? I've always been curious.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's like when you're selling a short story these days, like it's hard because you can't sell it for a lot of money, right? If you look now, Amazon recently created these new categories, 90-minute reads, or I don't know. There's a whole bunch of them, and it's like they're short stories, but it's becoming now there's a category, so you can search by those, and they're becoming popular. I've seen ones by big name authors. I think even there was a Jack Reacher short story, and there was a Freedom McFadden short story, all in the top 10, but they're 99 cents, right? And the way Amazon works, you're making 35 cents on that. So yeah, if you have a huge audience, it still can be profitable, but when you don't, it's hard to market that, right? Like how much ad spend can you really do when you're making 35 cents a copy? But that's from the marketing side of it. From the writing side of it, I think it's almost harder to write a really good short story than it is to write a novel, because you have to fit everything into a much, much smaller space. You have to create these memorable characters, and you have to have a good story and a satisfying conclusion. You have to do all of that in a much smaller space. Typically I have written mostly novels, but actually it's funny that you mentioned that, because after that the Terrence interview that we did, I started thinking about that short form sort of writing, and I started writing a short story, and it, and even going back a little bit more to what you were talking about in terms of, how you have to think tactically or not. Like when I was writing novels, I'm more of a planner, than a pantser, and I would, plan each chapter out, and I like having chapters ending on sort of cliffhanger, so I would sort of plan those out, like, okay, this happens, and it ends with this, and then it ends with this, so that it would always end on something. But with this short story, I'm just sort of writing it off the cuff. Like I have an idea of the whole thing, but what I'm doing to try to still do that is I go until something interesting happens that I think would be a good place to break, then that'll become chapter. And then so I've done it in that sense. And I wasn't even sure I should have chapters in the short story. I was looking at some of the ones that are out there, and it's like they do, most of them. So I'm like, okay, well, I can have chapters, but they're very short chapters, and so it's got to end on something. So you still want to keep it moving, keep it flowing. But yeah, I mean, I find that what's going through my head is, if I did try to publish this one, how would I really market it? Because it's almost like you don't want to put much money into it unless you have a lot. So the authors that are doing it, when you say, do we talk to authors that are doing it? We do, and Terrence was one, but other ones that I've talked to, I think what they do is they put out short story collections so that they can sell it at a full price. It's a full book, but it's a whole bunch of short stories, and that way, it's still a novel. They can charge whatever they charge for a novel, but it's just a collection of short stories. And that's kind of what I was thinking too, is like I put it out and leave it, and put it out and put it out. Like I'll have a whole bunch, and then pull them together into a collection, and then maybe that's the one I would try to sell.
When you're two quick reflections. First, you could tell that I'm excited about this conversation only because I'm a person that takes my glasses on and off when I talk. So I don't know if there's a video element here. Just know that's but also when I'm excited, my glasses fog up to the point where I'm so fired up that I couldn't even see. So I'm taking them off permanently. But so as far as the last thing because I'm nerding about the short stories, from a self-publishing point of view, and I know that you have, but do you, when consulting with authors who maybe are trying to leverage the short narrative as a form of discovery, as a form of brand awareness, author awareness, whatever you want to call it, it's just about going into a crowded space and getting more people to see what you're writing? Are things like Substack or Twitter, X now, or other emerging social platforms, these are always challenging, I feel, because they're proprietary, because they're algorithmic, and that can always be tough because you're getting into a crowd that then sort of like shapes the sharing of something. You're kind of leaning on virality, and it still takes time. But is that a venue that a lot of authors are using in the short form, where it's like, we're going to just hit you every day with a four thread or 4-piece a story? Are people innovating in that space? I'm sure they are, but I just didn't know from a writing standpoint, if when you're talking to authors, that's something that people are exploring or that you're recommending that they do. Not for a guarantee, but as far as an outlet that can be controlled, but that is also something that can be time friendly. And is that something people are using or leaning into a lot?
Absolutely. We've done podcasts about Substack, and it's interesting, though. I don't think many authors are using it algorithmically. They're not looking to be discovered. They're more using it as they connect with their audience and they expand their reach and their audience on social media and say, this is a way you can support me and keep in contact with me. But it's interesting. Writing is the part of that.
Yeah, and some authors will write like a prequel novella or something and use that as a giveaway to try to pull people into their series, and they'll give that away on BookFunnel or whatever. And then to get it, you got to sign up for their newsletter or whatever. And then that allows them to write something that doesn't take them a huge amount of time. They know they can't really make a huge amount of money selling it, so they use it as a free giveaway. But I think that it's interesting because I think that there's a market for it, but people haven't really figured it all out yet. Because if you look at Radish or Kindle Vella, right, those are both failed experiments where they created this service. I mean, Radish, they created this service where it was like basically they take a story and they break it into episodes and chunks, right, and then they sell those, and they try to like give the first few away, and then people have to use their credits to buy the rest, and then Amazon jumped on that boat and created Vella, right, and which was basically a copy of that, but then months later Vella folded, and then very recently Radish folded. So I don't know, that I think there might be a demand for it, but I don't know if people have figured out how to make it really, really work.
Because ultimately the destination is the read or the listen. And it's that direct connection we're all as creators, as storytellers, seeking. And that's one thing I'm very aware of. And I'm also rooting for other writers, authors, storytellers to keep innovating in the career growth space and trying to figure out ways to leverage that connection. We all are. But for me, what's interesting, what I like about the podcasting space, and I'm assuming there may or may not be something equivalent. What I like about it is that it is not social in nature. It is still like turning on the TV or turning on Netflix. It is still a one-to-one experience where you have to choose to listen, and then you can opt out and listen to something else. But it isn't swiping. You're not just scrolling. You're not flipping between, sort of dopamine hits. You're making a distinctive choice. And that's why I think, just like a reader, a podcast listener is equivalent in that is an important audience member. They, in this crowded landscape, have to get through a lot to get to your story. They have to get through a lot of crap, a lot of fluff, and if they find it through your own means of marketing or through partnerships or through working with folks like you, if they find it, then now you have a captive audience and a partnership with them. Then the question is, where are you all meeting? Now, in the back of the day, you met in the book. You had the publisher, the infrastructure, they printed the thing. Everyone's taking their cut. As musicians too. They're like, can we make any money here? But ultimately, you met at the book. And what I love about the podcast medium is that they're meeting at the audio. Now, Apple might be facilitating the audio. Pandora or what, keep going through Castbox or whatever, they might be facilitating the audio, but the audio is my stories and my copyright. And so what I always do is, I mean, I have my website always foundationally as my archive, so that no matter what, wherever it changes, I can always move them to that space, no matter what habits are there. And so, man, it would be such an amazing landscape if audiences, you know, at least even a increase of a small percentage could essentially, and I know people are doing this with self-published authors, where they're just going direct to the author and they're buying those books directly. And so whatever you guys are doing, that magic there, that's a beautiful thing. And I know that you know, at times you have to use Amazon and all these type of things because it shortens the gap. But wow, I would love to see a way in which authors had the same kind of luxury as podcasters do, to essentially have this direct connection that isn't exploited, so to speak, by the distributor to at least in extreme. And that eventually the percentage of those listeners or those readers have the option to go, you know what? Yeah, I've been reading on Amazon. I actually want to go to their website. I can get the same book and the same thing there. Wouldn't that be a treat? Yeah. I think that would be a beautiful thing for the writer, and I think for the reader too.
I think that's the future of publishing. Now, unfortunately, we've reached the top of the hour, actually, because
perfect cliffhanger. See?
Yeah, well, we had some technical difficulties, but we brought you back. And the thing is, you've been so fascinating to speak to. We've kind of gone over a bit. We want to cram it in there. Maybe we could have you back for a whole another episode, because I think we kind of pivoted a bit towards the end and moved on to the whole topic of how you can apply the storytelling things you told us to your career as an author. And I think you're about to nail this direct sales thing is huge. So unfortunately we have to wrap things up for this episode. But Craig, before Aaron tells us where we can find out more about him, do you have any final questions?
No, I mean, I love this discussion. I feel I was thinking maybe we should just make it a two-parter, but yeah, like what you were touching on before, you know, we've talked about that because Roland specifically has worked a lot with the direct sales model, which is, you know, he's created his website and people come there. It's a harder model though. It's a lot of more work, and, you know, cutting out the middleman isn't as easy as it should be, but anyways, yeah, thanks for coming on, and we can save all this for another episode and have you on again soon, because there's, you know, so much we could talk to you about. But yeah, this has been really, really fascinating.
I can't wait. Let me know anytime. Could be a month or a year from now, but a part 2's in the works, and I think we left on a great cliffhanger.
Well, thank you so much, Aaron. Now, everyone who's loved everything you've had to say, where can they find more about you, more from you? Where can they sign up for the podcast? Everything like that.
All they have to do is just go to their favorite search engine and type in 7-minute stories. That's the number 7-minute stories. And the first 2 or 3 pages will be everything you need, whether it's Apple, whether it's a website, whether it's Spotify, wherever. You can find me there and kind of follow the breadcrumbs and learn more about me.
Fantastic. Well, we will pop a link down below in the description. So pause what you're doing, scroll down to the description to click on that link. But while you go, you pass that big empty comment box. So make sure you leave Aaron a comment and let him know how much you appreciated everything he has shared with us today, and how excited you are about this part 2 that is going to be coming up. And while you're there, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, that like button, and there's that little bell icon that gives you a notification every time there is a new episode. And of course, there will be a brand new episode next week. So until then, cheerio.